On December 30, 1853, in Mexico City, American diplomat James Gadsden and Mexican President Antonio López de Santa Anna signed a treaty that would transfer nearly 30,000 square miles of Mexican territory to the United States for $10 million. This land, a seemingly barren stretch of desert in what is now southern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico, represented the final piece of America's continental expansion, the last significant territorial acquisition that would complete the outline of the contiguous United States as we know it today. The purchase, named after the American diplomat who negotiated it, was ostensibly made to secure a practical southern railroad route to connect the newly acquired territories of California to the rest of the nation, a transcontinental link that would bind the Pacific coast to the eastern states and facilitate the movement of goods, people and military forces across the vast American domain. Yet the Gadsden Purchase was far more than a simple real estate transaction for a railroad corridor. It represented the culmination of American expansionist ambitions that had driven the nation since independence. Ambitions. The resolution of boundary disputes left unsettled by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the Mexican-American War in 1848. The intersection of sectional politics as North and South competed for influence over transcontinental railroad routes, the continued exploitation of Mexican weakness and political instability, and the final assertion of American dominance over the North American continent south of British Canada. Understanding why America paid $10 million for this strip of desert requires examining the complex web of motivations, from practical engineering concerns about railroad grades and mountain passes to political calculations about slavery's expansion, from diplomatic maneuvering to resolve boundary ambiguities to economic interests in mineral resources and trade routes, from personal ambitions of politicians and railroad promoters to broader ideological commitments to manifest destiny and continental empire that had animated American foreign policy for decades. The story of the Gadsden Purchase begins not in 1853, but 5 years earlier, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the Mexican-American War. That treaty, signed in February 1848, had forced Mexico to cede approximately 500,000 square miles of territory, including California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, effectively transferring half of Mexico's national territory to the United States. The treaty established the new boundary between the two nations, running along the Rio Grande River from the Gulf of Mexico to the southern boundary of New Mexico, then west to the Gila River, and along the Gila to the Colorado River, then following a line to the Pacific Ocean just south of San Diego. This boundary, drawn by negotiators working with inadequate maps and imprecise geographic knowledge, created immediate problems that would plague relations between the two countries and ultimately necessitate the Gadsden Purchase. The maps used during the Guadalupe Hidalgo negotiations, particularly the diurnal map that was specifically referenced in the treaty, contained significant errors in the location of key geographic features, placing El Paso and the Rio Grande several miles from their actual positions. When American and Mexican surveyors attempted to mark the actual boundary on the ground beginning in 1849, these cartographic errors created disputes about where exactly the line should run, with each side interpreting the ambiguous treaty language to maximize its own territorial claims. The Boundary Commission's work revealed that the intended southern route for a transcontinental railroad would pass through territory that, under any reasonable interpretation of the treaty, remained part of Mexico. The discovery of gold in Vun, California in 1848, just as the Mexican War ended, had created urgent pressure for better transportation links between the East Coast and the Pacific. The California gold rush brought hundreds of thousands of fortune seekers streaming westward, creating a booming economy in California and demonstrating that the newly acquired territories were not worthless desert, but regions of enormous economic potential. The need to connect California to the rest of the nation became a paramount concern for American political and economic leaders. Several potential routes for a transcontinental route were under consideration, including a northern route to the territories of Minnesota and Washington, a central route through the South Pass in Wyoming that generally followed the Oregon Trail, and a southern route that would run from Texas or Louisiana through New Mexico and southern Arizona to southern California. Each route had powerful political advocates, and the choice of route had enormous implications for sectional power, economic development, and the expansion of slavery. The southern route, strongly favored by Southern politicians and railroad promoters, offered significant advantages from an engineering perspective. It avoided the Rocky Mountains' highest peaks and could maintain relatively gentle grades suitable for railroad construction. With the technology available in the 1850s, it passed through regions that, while desert, had milder winters than northern routes, allowing year-round operation without the danger of heavy snows blocking mountain passes. The climate meant less expense for snow removal and fewer delays from winter storms. However, the most practical southern route, the one that offered the gentlest grades and most direct path, ran south of the Gila River through territory that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had left in Mexican hands. American engineers and surveyors exploring potential railroad routes concluded that attempting to build along the Gila River itself, which marked part of the boundary, would be prohibitively expensive and technically challenging due to the river's canyon passages and the mountainous terrain immediately north of it. The ideal route lay further south, through the valleys of southern Arizona and the relatively flat terrain around what is now Tucson and the border region. This geographic reality meant that if the United States wanted to build a southern transcontinental railroad, it would need to acquire additional territory from Mexico. The sectional political dimension of the transcontinental railroad question cannot be overstated, as it was inextricably linked to the increasingly bitter conflict over slavery's expansion that would ultimately tear the nation apart in civil war. Southern politicians and business interests desperately wanted the southern route, chosen because it would run through slave states and territories, channeling investment, population, and economic development to the south, strengthening the region economically and politically. A southern railroad would connect southern ports like New Orleans and Galveston to California, facilitating southern trade and potentially opening California to greater southern influence. Northern politicians and interests equally desperately wanted a northern or central route that would benefit free states and territories, channeling development to regions where slavery was prohibited and strengthening free state political power. The Transcontinental Railroad was understood by all sides not merely as transportation infrastructure, but as a crucial determinant of which section would dominate the rapidly expanding West and whether slavery would spread or be contained. The railroad would determine where cities grew, where immigrants settled, which regions prospered, and ultimately whether new states admitted to the Union would be slave or free. This sectional competition meant that the railroad route question became one of the most politically charged issues of the early 1850s, contributing to the breakdown of compromise and rise of sectional extremism that would lead to the Civil War. Into this complex situation stepped James Gadsden, a South Carolina railroad promoter with close ties to Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who would later become President of the Confederate States during the Civil War. Gadsden was a perfect representative of Southern interests in transcontinental railroad development, a man whose career had been devoted to railroad expansion and who understood both the technical requirements of railroad construction and the political dimensions of route selection. He had served as president of the South Carolina Railroad Company and was an enthusiastic advocate for a southern transcontinental route. Jefferson Davis, as Secretary of War in President Franklin Pierce's administration, was the most powerful Southern voice in the cabinet and the most ardent supporter of a southern railroad route. Davis had used his authority to order Army surveys of potential railroad routes and these surveys confirmed that the best southern route required acquiring additional Mexican territory. Davis and other southern leaders concluded that the United States needed to purchase or otherwise acquire the land south of the Gila River, and they convinced President Pierce to authorize negotiations with Mexico for this purpose. Pierce appointed Gadsden as minister to Mexico in May 1853, with explicit instructions to negotiate the purchase of as much northern Mexican territory as possible, with the specific goal of securing land for a railroad route, but with broader ambitions for additional territorial acquisition, if circumstances permitted. Gadsden's instructions from the Pierce administration reflected expansionist appetites that extended far beyond the narrow strip needed for a railroad. Pierce and his advisors, particularly Secretary of War Davis and Secretary of State William Marcy, envisioned acquiring a substantial portion of northern Mexico, potentially including all of Baja California, large parts of the Mexican states of Sonora and Chihuahua, and additional territory that would give the United States control of natural resources, potential ports on the Gulf of California, and strategic depth south of the existing boundary. The instructions authorized Gadsden to offer up to $50 million for a massive territorial cession that would include much of northern Mexico. This reflected the continuing influence of manifest destiny ideology and the belief among many Americans that further expansion southward into Mexico was both inevitable and desirable. Some expansionists dreamed of acquiring all of Mexico, arguing that Mexican political instability and economic backwardness meant the country would benefit from American annexation, conveniently ignoring Mexican opposition to further territorial losses and the racist assumptions underlying such arguments. The railroad served as the politically acceptable justification for negotiations, but the actual ambitions of Pierce administration expansionists extended much further. However, Gadsden discovered upon arriving in Mexico City that the political situation was far more complex and that acquiring vast territories would be impossible. Mexico in 1853 was in the midst of yet another political crisis, the latest in a series of upheavals that had characterized Mexican politics since independence. Antonio López de Santa Anna, the controversial general and politician who had led Mexican forces against Texas in 1836 and against the United States in 1847, had returned to power in April 1853 after years of exile. Santa Anna was one of the most remarkable and frustrating figures in Mexican history, a man of undeniable political skill and personal charisma, who nonetheless repeatedly led Mexico to disaster through a combination of autocratic tendencies, financial irresponsibility, and strategic miscalculation. He had lost a leg fighting French forces in 1838 and fashioned himself as a wounded hero of Mexican nationalism. Yet he was also willing to sell Mexican territory to solve immediate financial and political problems without regard for long-term consequences. Santa Anna's return to power in 1853 came at a moment of extreme crisis for Mexico. The treasury was empty, debts were overwhelming, the government could barely pay soldiers or bureaucrats, and regional rebellions threatened to tear the country apart. The loss of half the national territory in 1848 had been followed by continued instability, economic stagnation, and growing desperation among the political elite. Santa Anna needed money desperately and was willing to negotiate another territorial cession, despite the political risks. Mexican public opinion was bitterly opposed to selling any more land to the United States. After the humiliation of losing half the country in the recent war, and any Mexican leader who ceded more territory risked revolution and possible execution. Yet Santa Anna calculated that he could justify a limited sale by arguing it was necessary to avoid American military action to seize the disputed territory by force. The boundary disputes created by the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty's ambiguities provided a pretext, as Mexican and American commissioners had failed to agree on the exact boundary line, and some Americans were openly discussing using military force to impose American interpretations. Santa Anna could argue he was preventing war and resolving dangerous disputes while gaining desperately needed funds for the treasury. Additionally, the territory in question, the desert regions of northern Sonora and southern Arizona, were sparsely populated by Mexican citizens, difficult for the Mexican government to control or develop, and subject to frequent Apache raids that Mexico lacked military capacity to suppress. From a coldly pragmatic perspective, selling land Mexico could not effectively govern or defend in exchange for money the government desperately needed had a certain logic, even if it was politically toxic and nationally humiliating. The negotiations between Gadsden and Santa Anna in the fall of 1853 involved intense haggling over how much territory would be transferred and for what price. Gadsden initially pushed for the expansive acquisitions authorized in his instructions, offering to purchase all of Baja California, large portions of northern Mexican states, and other territories for the maximum authorized sum. Santa Anna refused these demands, recognizing that such a massive cession would trigger immediate revolution and likely cost him his life. Even Santa Anna, willing as he was to sell territory, understood there were limits to what Mexican politics would tolerate. The negotiations deadlocked repeatedly, as Gadsden pressed for more land, and Santa Anna resisted, seeking to minimize the cession while maximizing the payment. Both men understood the political constraints they faced. Gadsden needed to bring home a treaty that Southern expansionists would accept, that would provide adequate land for the railroad route, and that would be worth the price paid. Santa Anna needed a treaty he could defend to Mexican public opinion, that would not trigger immediate overthrow, and that would provide enough money to address Mexico's financial crisis. The final compromise reached in December 1853 involved the transfer of approximately 47,000 square miles south of the Gila River for $15 million, a significantly smaller territorial cession than Gadsden's instructions had authorized, but still a substantial acquisition. However, this version of the treaty faced immediate problems when submitted to the United States Senate for ratification. Northern senators, recognizing that the acquisition primarily served Southern interests by facilitating a Southern railroad route and potentially opening territory to slavery, opposed the treaty's terms. Anti-expansionist senators argued the price was too high for desert land and that the acquisition served no legitimate national interest. The Senate debate revealed the deep sectional divisions over westward expansion and the transcontinental railroad question. Northern senators used their votes to force modifications to the treaty, reducing both the territory acquired and the price paid. The Senate amended the treaty to reduce the land transferred to approximately 29,800 square miles and cut the price from $15 million to $10 million. This revised treaty was what ultimately received Senate approval and was ratified by Mexico, though Santa Anna's government reluctantly accepted the reduced payment because it still desperately needed the money and feared that rejecting the treaty might provoke American military action to seize the territory without compensation. The territory acquired in the Gadsden Purchase, though relatively small compared to earlier acquisitions like Louisiana or the Mexican Cession of 1848, nonetheless had significant geographic and strategic value beyond the railroad corridor. The purchase established the modern boundary between the United States and Mexico, a boundary that has remained essentially unchanged to the present day except for minor adjustments from river course changes and later agreements to resolve small disputed areas. The acquisition included the Mesilla Valley, an area of relatively fertile land along the Rio Grande that had been particularly disputed during the Boundary Commission's work, and that had attracted American settlers even before the purchase was completed. The purchase included the area around what is now Tucson, Arizona, one of the few significant population centers in the region, and a strategic location controlling approaches from Mexico. The territory contained mineral resources, including copper deposits that would later be developed and become economically significant, though these were not major considerations. In 1853, when the resources were largely unknown, the acquisition provided the United States with undisputed control over approaches to California from the south and eliminated any remaining Mexican claims to territory that might have served as bases for future conflict. The railroad justification that ostensibly motivated the purchase proved ironic because the Southern Transcontinental Railroad was not completed along the anticipated route for decades. The sectional political conflicts that made the purchase difficult to ratify also prevented agreement on a transcontinental railroad route throughout the 1850s. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 ended any possibility of a southern route being chosen during that period, as secession of southern states meant they could not participate in federal railroad planning. The first transcontinental railroad, completed in 1869, followed a central route through Nebraska, Wyoming, and Nevada to California. The route favored by northern interests once southern opposition was eliminated by secession. A southern transcontinental route through the Gadsden Purchase territory was not completed until 1881, when the Southern Pacific Railroad built a line from New Orleans through Texas across southern New Mexico and Arizona to California. This railroad did eventually use the corridor that had been the stated reason for the purchase, and the relatively gentle grades and favorable climate did prove advantageous as predicted. But the delay of nearly 30 years meant that the purchase's immediate railroad justification was somewhat hollow. The purchase's political consequences proved more immediate and significant than its railroad impact. The acquisition intensified sectional tensions over slavery expansion and contributed to the breakdown of political compromise that would lead to the Civil War. Northern opponents of the purchase saw it correctly as primarily a Southern project designed to facilitate Southern interests and potentially expand slavery into new territories. The fact that the treaty was negotiated by a South Carolina railroad promoter at the behest of a Southern-dominated administration, supported primarily by Southern senators, and justified by the need for a Southern railroad route, made its sectional nature transparent. The purchase contributed to Northern suspicions that Southern leaders were engaged in a conspiracy to expand slavery through territorial acquisition, suspicions that fueled the growth of the Republican Party and anti-slavery political movements in the North. The purchase also demonstrated to many Northerners that the Mexican War's acquisitions had not satisfied Southern territorial appetites, and that continued pressure for expansion southward would persist, potentially leading to additional conflicts with Mexico or attempts to acquire Cuba, Central America, or other territories where slavery might be established. For Mexico, the Gadsden Purchase represented yet another humiliation and another loss of territory to American expansion, though on a much smaller scale than the 1848 cession. Santa Anna's government attempted to justify the sale as necessary to avoid war and to resolve dangerous boundary disputes. But Mexican public opinion was outraged and the sale contributed to Santa Anna's eventual overthrow in 1855. The purchase confirmed Mexican fears that the United States would continue to encroach on Mexican territory whenever opportunity presented itself, and that Mexican weakness invited American aggression. The boundary established by the Gadsden Purchase finally provided a clear, mutually accepted line between the two nations, reducing the likelihood of future boundary disputes triggering war, but it came at the cost of further territorial loss and renewed humiliation. Mexican historians have generally viewed the Gadsden Purchase as another episode in American imperialism toward Mexico, a continuation of the aggressive expansionism that had already cost Mexico half its territory and that demonstrated the United States would exploit Mexican weakness whenever possible. The strategic and diplomatic significance of the Gadsden Purchase lay in its finality as the last significant territorial acquisition in the contiguous United States. After 1853, American continental expansion was essentially complete, with the outline of the lower 48 states established in its modern form. Future territorial acquisitions would be different in character, involving Alaska purchased from Russia in 1867, Hawaii annexed in 1898, and various smaller territories and possessions acquired through purchase or as consequences of the Spanish-American War and other conflicts, but none of these involved the kind of direct continental expansion across North America that had characterized American growth from 1783 to 1853. The Gadsden Purchase marked the end of an era of American history, the conclusion of the expansionist project that had begun with independence and that had driven American foreign policy for 7 decades. After 1853, American expansionist energies would turn in different directions, toward economic penetration of Latin America, toward acquisition of overseas possessions, toward continental consolidation and development of already acquired territories. But the age of conquering contiguous North American territory was finished. The engineering and technical considerations that ostensibly justified the purchase deserve examination to understand whether the railroad argument was genuine or merely a convenient pretext for territorial acquisition serving other agendas. Railroad engineering in the 1850s faced significant limitations that made route selection crucial to feasibility and cost. Steam locomotives of the era had limited power and could not efficiently climb steep grades, meaning that railroad routes needed to maintain relatively gentle slopes, generally not exceeding 2 to 3% grade for extended distances. Mountain passes that could be crossed by wagons might still be impassable for railroads if grades were too steep. The Gadsden Purchase territory included several mountain passes and valleys that offered gentler grades than routes further north along the Gila River, and engineers who surveyed potential routes consistently concluded that a railroad through the purchased territory would be significantly less expensive to construct and more efficient to operate than alternatives. The climate considerations were equally legitimate, as heavy winter snows that blocked northern routes would not affect southern routes through desert regions. The operational cost savings from year-round operation and reduced snow removal expenses were substantial. From a purely technical engineering perspective, the railroad justification for the purchase was sound and reflected genuine practical advantages of the southern route. However, the technical advantages do not mean that railroad engineering alone motivated the purchase, as the political, sectional, and strategic considerations were clearly paramount. The railroad served as the publicly acceptable justification that could build support for the purchase. But the actual motivations of key advocates like Jefferson Davis included strengthening Southern influence over Western development, opening potential territory for slavery expansion, and continuing the broader project of American continental expansion. The purchase represented the intersection of practical infrastructure needs with expansionist ideology and sectional politics, where the railroad corridor served as the excuse for acquiring territory that served multiple agendas. This pattern of using infrastructure and development as justification for territorial expansion while serving broader imperial goals was common in 19th-century American expansionism, and would continue in subsequent projects like the Panama Canal, where strategic and imperial motives were cloaked in the language of commercial necessity and civilizational progress. The Native American dimension of the Gadsden Purchase receives less attention in conventional histories, but was significant for the indigenous peoples whose lands were being transferred between empires without their consent. The purchased territory was home to Apache bands, Tohono O'odham peoples, and other indigenous groups who had been fighting to maintain their independence against both Mexican and American encroachment for decades. For these peoples, the purchase meant transferring from one colonial power to another, neither of which recognized indigenous sovereignty or territorial rights. The United States military would spend decades after the purchase fighting Apache peoples to impose American control over the acquired territory, campaigns that would continue into the 1880s and would involve the forced removal of Apache populations to reservations, the destruction of their traditional ways of life, and the deaths of countless individuals through warfare, forced relocation, and disease. The Gadsden Purchase, like all American territorial acquisitions, involved the dispossession of indigenous peoples and the imposition of colonial control. facts that were invisible in the diplomatic and political discussions of the time but that represented catastrophic consequences for native populations. The price of $10 million, roughly $336 per square mile, seems extraordinarily cheap from a modern perspective, though it represented substantial funds in the 1850s, when the entire federal budget was measured in tens of millions of dollars. The price must be understood in the context of contemporary land values and the perception that the territory was largely worthless desert with little obvious economic potential. The United States was essentially purchasing sovereignty over territory rather than paying for developed land with infrastructure and improvements. The sparsely populated desert regions of southern Arizona and New Mexico had minimal development, few settlers, limited known resources, and hostile indigenous populations, making the territory appear to have little immediate value beyond the strategic and political considerations that motivated the purchase. The price also reflected the bargaining position of the two countries, with Mexico desperate for funds and the United States in a position to dictate terms, backed by the implicit threat of military seizure if Mexico refused to negotiate. The Senate's reduction of the price from $15 million to $10 million demonstrated American ability to impose terms even in a negotiated purchase, extracting concessions from Mexican weakness. The long-term consequences of the Gadsden Purchase for both nations proved significant, far beyond what anyone anticipated in 1853. For the United States, the acquisition completed the territorial foundation for continental power and provided the land that would eventually support significant population and economic development. Cities like Tucson would grow from small outposts to major urban centers. The copper mining industry would become economically crucial, and the territory would eventually form parts of the states of Arizona and New Mexico. Admitted to the Union in 1912, the Southern Railroad route, though delayed, would eventually become a vital transportation corridor linking the Southwest to the rest of the nation. The purchase eliminated the last remaining boundary disputes with Mexico along the land border, establishing a clear line that would prevent future conflicts over territorial claims, even as it created new challenges related to immigration, trade, and border security that persist to the present. For Mexico, the Gadsden Purchase represented the final territorial loss to the United States in a series of catastrophes that had seen the country lose more than half its original territory in a single generation. The psychological and political impact of these losses shaped Mexican nationalism and Mexican attitudes toward the United States for generations, creating a legacy of resentment and suspicion that would influence relations between the two countries down to the present day. Mexican political instability continued after 1853, with Santa Anna overthrown in 1855, and the country descending into civil war between liberals and conservatives, followed by French intervention and the imposition of Emperor Maximilian in the 1860s. The territorial losses to the United States contributed to Mexican weakness and instability by removing economically valuable territories, reducing tax base and population, damaging national morale, and demonstrating that Mexican governments could not effectively defend national territory against foreign aggression. The question of whether Mexico might have developed differently had it retained its northern territories is one of history's great counterfactuals, impossible to answer definitively, but endlessly debatable. The Gadsden Purchase stands as a case study in how territorial expansion in the 19th century involved complex interactions between practical considerations like infrastructure development, strategic and geopolitical calculations about national power and security, sectional and political conflicts over how territorial expansion would affect domestic political balances, ideological commitments to expansion and empire, disguised as civilizing missions, economic interests in resources and development opportunities, in political, diplomatic maneuvering that exploited rival weakness and internal instability, and the fundamental reality that territorial expansion involved the dispossession and displacement of existing populations, whether indigenous peoples or citizens of the losing nation. The purchase demonstrated how practical needs like railroad routes could be leveraged to justify expansionist policy serving broader agendas, how sectional conflicts within expanding nations shaped the direction and character of expansion, and how weak nations could be pressured to cede territory through a combination of financial pressure, diplomatic coercion, and implicit military threats, without requiring actual warfare. The railroad that supposedly justified the purchase did eventually get built, and the territory did eventually prove far more valuable than the $10 million paid for it, vindicating in a sense the decision to acquire the land even if the immediate railroad justification was partially pretextual. Yet the acquisition's true significance lies not in whether the railroad was built or whether the land proved valuable, but in what the purchase reveals about the nature of American expansionism in the 19th century, the methods by which continental empire was constructed, the exploitation of Mexican weakness and American power disparities, the role of infrastructure development in justifying imperial expansion, and the complex political calculations that drove territorial acquisition in an era when expansion westward was considered not just desirable, but essential to national power and destiny. The Gadsden Purchase of December 30, 1853. The Gadsden Purchase of December 30, 1853 was the final act in a 7-decade drama of American continental expansion, a relatively minor footnote compared to Louisiana or the Mexican Cession, but nonetheless the closing of a chapter in American history and the completion of a continental empire that would provide the foundation for America's rise to global power in the century to come.